Hey everyone, I'm Richard and this is Doom 2016 1080p Ultra settings. In fact, we're actually running beyond Ultra here with a couple of additional tweaks, 16x anisotropic filtering and nightmare level texture streaming. And yes, 60 FPS. Now we've just put together a gaming PC that won't cost the earth but should open the door to this kind of experience. And in fact, the entire build is documented in a separate video linked to in the video description below. So I wanted to put my money where my mouth is to show that the parts we chose can indeed deliver this kind of experience. Okay, so when you first power up the machine, you'll get this message, which is basically what happens when you put in new components. So yeah, this is the MSI BIOS for the Gaming Carbon Pro, and first of all we're going to be enabling XMP and the advanced overclocking menu, which is a simple press of the F7 button. And there we go. XMP on, overclocking menu. Now we're not going to do an advanced overclock, but it's very easy to overclock an i5K chip. Literally change the CPU ratio to 40 and we are locked on all 4 cores to 4 GHz, which is fantastic and is considerably faster than any of the non-K i5s that you can get. Okay, so now we are in Windows and we're just going to check in CPU-Z that this is what we've got, and yep, 4 GHz confirmed. Quick look at the memory, and yes, 1500 MHz dual channel, so we're looking at 3000 MHz there. And yeah, we've actually had to swap in the Founders Edition GTX 1060 because our MSI board is elsewhere. So yeah, the MSI board basically adds 88 to the core and a minuscule 40 MHz to the RAM. So yeah, we're good to go. Now we're going to dip into The Witcher 3 here. Just a quick look at the settings now. Basically, everything on Ultra, a couple of settings I've tweaked down to high. Now the reason why is that this will basically give us a very stable 60 frames per second. Now here's the thing, when you are benchmarking, it's basically just, ramp up everything to the maximum and see how fast it can go. But this is about the experience, and I want to have 1080p 60 FPS for the vast majority of the duration with no stutter, no frame rate drops, or at least the very minimum. So yeah, The Witcher 3 here, those setting tweaks that I made seem to have done the job here. Now this area with the griffin when it lands creates a lot of alpha transparency effects, the same when The Witcher himself uses the fire magic there, but we're holding up pretty well here. So the setting tweaks I made there have done the job in terms of maintaining solid performance, and you don't really lose much in terms of the experience. Now in terms of the console comparisons here, as we do this Novigrad City run, we hit 30 FPS. In actual fact, we dip below, 26, 27. Now we're going to do the same run here through the town on our settings here, which are way beyond the console equivalents. And yeah, we're pretty much sticking to 60 FPS here, but note the CPU utilization there on the top right. It can be anything up to 100%, so think about that for a second. We are tapping out a Core i5 6600K at 4 GHz. That's pretty intense. So for those that say that the i5 is plenty of CPU power and will last for years, well, possibly so, but remember that you can actually hit CPU limits pretty easily. Now this is Hitman, and here's an interesting thing here. We've ramped up everything to ultra settings here, 1080p. Now the Paris stage is pretty notorious for being heavy on both CPU and GPU, something we discovered when we benchmarked the console versions. So yeah, interesting to see here that the GTX 1060 and the i5 here really can't keep up. I mean, I think we reach a minimum of 38 FPS there. So what can we do? Well, in actual fact, this is an example of how we have to actually match console settings or get pretty close to it in order to get a 1080p 60 lock on our gaming rig here. Basically, we need to match the consoles here, so we're going to have to hit medium settings on most of the presets, and we can keep the high textures in common with the console versions. One more thing I have done here is to use the high level of detail, which is a notch above the consoles. So let's see what that does after that disappointing first showing. Okay, yeah, so not bad at all. So this is slightly better than console equivalent settings, and we are getting pretty much a locked 60 frames per second. So yeah, that's a pretty big jump from 38. But it's interesting that ramping up the quality settings produces such a big hit to performance. But when we drop down to a combination of medium and high, well, we're not really losing that much, but what we are gaining is temporal resolution, silky smooth fluidity on the game, and it really does help here. So yeah, we're just going to go in through the foyer here, and this is where the CPU is going to start getting some heat, because it's going to be getting higher and higher as we deal with all of those NPCs there on 70% at the moment. Oh yeah, one thing that is quite interesting to note here is that we are using a Corsair H60 closed water loop cooler here. And yeah, we've got a 4 GHz overclock. Now check out the CPU temperatures there, 34, 35 degrees there. That's pretty damn awesome. 41 degrees on one core there. That is pretty astonishing for a 4 GHz overclock. And yeah, just taking a look at the thermometer in my office here. Pretty warm day today, 27 degrees ambient temperature here. So to get that kind of temperature with an overclock, not bad at all. So yeah, Hitman, we got there, 1080p 60, not bad at all, but we did have to make some compromises. Okay, so now Grand Theft Auto 5. This is locked to 30 FPS on the PS4 and the Xbox One, and the settings are kind of like a mixture of medium, high, ultra, pretty much a grab bag of different presets there. So with our setup here, we're running at pretty much maximum settings on the standard settings. We're leaving the advanced alone for now. And the only real compromise has come from turning off multi-sampling, anti-aliasing and reflection MSAA. Otherwise, we're maxed here. So yeah, I think there's pretty much more that we can get from the GPU here. If you look at the top there, we're in the 70s in terms of GPU utilization, so we could probably push on and get even more visual effects from the GPU there. Interesting to note that the temperature on the Founders Edition GTX 1060 very, very low here, 47 degrees. If this was a third-party board like the MSI Gaming X that we've got, it would be even cooler. Now, one thing I wanted to test here was the grass. We've got that set to Ultra here. When we were doing our GTX 1080 4K testing, we had to have everything on kind of high settings, but the grass we had to drop to medium, and even then we were having problems. But the good news is that here I'm just taking a sort of random trip through the hills here. This would be crippling the 1080 at 4K on lower settings, but the 1060, 1080p still doing pretty well here. GPU utilization still in the 70s. It's cropping up into the 80s now, but regardless, we've got plenty of overhead here to maintain a rock solid 1080p 60. Fantastic stuff. So I was looking at the SSD for this machine, and I found that F1 2016 was installed, and obviously Dave was looking at that recently for the face-off, and we didn't really do a huge amount of GPU testing for that on PC, so I thought I'd see what happens with our system here. I did give this a quick go before. Ultra high settings across the board will see some impact to performance, so what I've done here is turn down shadows to high, but I think that was pretty much it. So we're looking to do a stress test here. This is Monaco wet weather. I had to actually stop to allow a bunch of cars to pass, and yeah, again, rock solid 60 frames per second. Now this is something I would expect really, because the console versions aim for 60 FPS but don't quite hit it, and PS4 has the 1080p resolution, but you know, getting a lot of adaptive VSync tearing there, which is not great at all. So yeah, Monaco wet weather is a good test, and also Azerbaijan. This time I selected Sauber so I didn't have to allow the cars to pass me. I'd be pretty much at the back anyway, and yeah, this is another complex track and can cause performance issues, but with the settings we've got here, which is pretty much ultra, good to go. Okay, so Mirror's Edge Catalyst, game from DICE here. It is 900p on PS4 and 720p on Xbox One. Here we're running on 1080p Ultra with hyper level texture quality. And yeah, again, lots of overhead here. You can see that our GPU utilization in the 80s here. We never dip below 60 FPS really. There might be room to engage a few of the hyper level presets, but I'm not really sure it's worth it. The visual return there isn't particularly fantastic. You get beautiful experience at 1080p 60 on Ultra with this. And well, I've only really engaged the hyper level textures because I know I've got the VRAM available to do it. And in actual fact, if you look at the MSI Afterburner readout on the top right there, we're still under 4 gigs even with the hyper mode textures, so that's quite interesting. Okay, another quick test of a DICE game, another console title that is designed to run at 60 FPS, but again, 900p on PS4, 720 on Xbox One. Again, ultra settings here, 1080p, big jump in pixel count, big increase in pixel quality, and we're using the Endor speeder bike training mission to stress test, and yes, doing pretty well here. Again, GPU utilization at around 78-80% there. Good stuff. visually spectacular game, and the ability to run this at full HD resolution with the engine effectively maxed out is a joy, to be honest. Really enjoyed this game. Fantastic stuff. Okay, so the final test here is going to be Crysis 3. Interesting one this, because this game will max out practically any system, and it's no exaggeration to say that even our 1080p 60 gaming build here does struggle. So settings wise, I'm on very high SMAAT2X, and I have actually dropped shadows from high to medium, and the reason why is that alpha really incurs a big hit on this game. Even with this GPU, you might have noticed that when the helicopter flew by there earlier. So yeah, a complete 1080p 60 lock will require more aggressive quality preset tweaking. I didn't really want to go too far there because this game does look spectacular and the frame rate drops are fairly minimal. Spectacular looking game though, even now. I mean, this game is 3 years old now, and this is the third stage. Actually, this is slightly less taxing on resources than the second, which is our first look at the game's jungle. We will revisit that shortly, but in the meantime you can see that for the most part the game is locked to 1080p 60 and it's a real visual treat. So yeah, I've actually been replaying this at 4K for another project that I'm handling at the moment using GTX 1080 and Titan X, and that's been absolutely fantastic. What I will say is that the first half of the campaign is really spectacular, but the second half, very forgettable, very dull, so I might just leave it there actually. Okay, so we're going to drop back to the jungle stage here. This is the end of the Welcome to the Jungle stage. It's the second level in Crysis 3, and you will note that we are getting frame rate dips here, and they can be quite pronounced, particularly when there's a lot of physics work going on, and there's a lot of that, a lot of physics and a lot of alpha. It really does stress the engine. Now, one thing I do want you to take a look at, once again, CPU 1 to 4 there on the top right. You will see the percentage indicators of CPU load there, and we're looking at 80 to 90, sometimes even higher, 95, 97% there on the readouts. So yeah, this is another indicator that although you can have a really powerful current generation Intel Core CPU, a quad core no less, you can still hit the CPU limits even on older titles. And yes, an i7 paired with the same GPU would produce a more consistent readout here, and if you unlock the frame rate you would get considerably higher performance. I think we can pretty much assume that it's the draw calls on all of the geometry here that is causing the issues here. i7, even an older i7, actually performs a touch better, whereas the 6700K, no problem whatsoever. Okay, so we're going to end this video with the actual sequence that we use from Crysis 3 for our benchmarks. Now obviously we can't test every single game and check that we get 1080p 60 on every single title, but there's a few things to bear in mind here in order to optimize performance. First of all, if you are dropping frames, I highly recommend adjusting shadow quality as your first port of call. Something that I find quite interesting is that the kind of dithered edges you often find on medium quality shadows are actually kind of more realistic compared to what you see in real life, whereas the sort of hard edged shadows that you see when shadow quality is ramped up to the max, it has a huge drain on GPU resources and doesn't kind of look so real to my eyes. So this is always the first port of call that I have when I want to claw back some frame rate. And secondly, MSAA is becoming a bit of a relic. Typically modern game engines use a system called deferred shading, which really hits performance hard if you factor in MSAA. I mean, anything up to 20-30% of your frame rate can go just by using MSAA. There will always be post-process equivalents in these titles, so SMAA is good as we're using in Crysis here. Even FXAA can look pretty good, although it is kind of getting quite old now. But anyway, yeah, worth bearing that in mind. We've got an exceptionally powerful PC here that shouldn't cost a lot of money to put together, but there's no magic bullet here for 1080p 60 performance, ultra settings on every title. You are going to have to compromise, but I think the bottom line is that the compromise isn't really that much of a big deal visually. Personally, I'd always take the locked 60 FPS frame rate. Okay, so this is a hands-on with our gaming PC that we've just put together. Again, if you missed the construction video, that's linked below. Do like and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I'll catch you next time.